Hi, I'm Alisha Pradhan, a PhD student from University of Maryland, and today I'll be presenting on our work on understanding older adults' participation in design workshops. A central aspect of user-centered design is including individuals in the design process. But including older adults as co-designers isn't so straightforward. We do know that older adults can be creative and have much to contribute to the design process. But less is known about their rationales behind the actions that they take in these design activities. For example, in a 5-year-long co-design study, older adults who co-designed a technology did not seem very keen on adopting those technologies once researchers built them. Moreover, some research directly or indirectly indicates that during co-design activities, older adults might not always think about themselves. They might be designing for other older adults, grandchildren, or others in general. So this work kind of raises questions on our practices of co-design sessions with older adults. Are we really paying attention to what they are expressing? So with this motivation, we were interested in understanding who do older adults envision as the user of the technology that they are designing? And how do their attitudes towards technology impact their participation in design activities? Now, attitudes towards technology is a well-studied topic when it comes to older adults' practices around technology, use or not use. But less is known about how it impacts the design activities itself. So we conducted co-design workshops with older adults focusing on Internet of Things technologies. In our workshops, 6 older adults participated. To ensure that our participants had an IoT experience, we recruited from a longitudinal study that deployed various IoT technologies in form of motion sensors, door sensors, wearable activity monitor in people's homes. But in addition to that, some participants had also purchased off-the-shelf IoT technologies like smart speakers or doorbells and had installed in their homes. We conducted 2 workshops along with pre and post interviews to understand how older adults take part in design activities. Each workshop was personalized based on the findings from the previous activities. I'm going to explain that in detail and only the specific finding from each of the session that informed customizing the next part. I'm not going to venture into the detailed findings from each of these sessions, and if you would like to know more, please have a look at the paper. Now, these decisions to scaffold each activity based on the findings from the previous ones is closely linked to our overall findings. We conducted one-to-one initial sessions, interviews, which helped us in customizing the first workshop, which was a focus group. Now, these interviews helped us to identify the topic to choose for the focus group discussion. We analyzed the interviews to identify daily activities that older adults mentioned the most, which were health and hobbies. For example, here participants passionately shared their interests in stitching, painting, interest in being more active, etc. So the initial interviews gave us the topic of discussion for the first workshop. Now, in the first workshop's focus group, participants, they chose between health and hobbies. And they shared their specific activities of interest, the motivations or frustrations behind them. The goal of this workshop was to brainstorm scenarios of daily activities that are important and meaningful to our participants. Now I'll explain the big picture findings from this workshop later. For now, I want to share how the first workshop discussion was used to customize the next design workshop. So we open-coded participant discussions of the first workshop and created 6 what-if scenarios. So these scenarios were contextualized by participant codes. So this is an example of a scenario, that is the pill medication notifier. The what-if situation is, what if there is a pill box that reminds you if pills weren't taken out by a certain time? And then here it is contextualized by a participant code that participants mentioned in the first workshop. So there were 5 other scenarios, including monitoring vitals, taking care of the house, etc. Now these scenarios, they were presented to participants in the second workshop. In between the two workshops, 5 out of 6 participants took part in an optional take-home activity with a journal and a Polaroid camera, where they shared more about their daily lives, what things that they would want their house to sense or give feedback about. So this activity was helpful for us in understanding participants' rationales during the design workshop, something which I'll discuss in the findings. Now, in the design workshop, second workshop, which was the design workshop, participants met again to envision technologies that they would like to use in their own homes. Now, the design materials used in this session were kind of personalized. So the personalizing or customizing of these design materials was important. Again, it is closely linked to our overall findings. Now, the scenario cards were built from the first workshop. The object cards included common objects mentioned in workshop 1 and initial interview. Then there were input and output cards, which were adapted from an existing card deck, but we also added a voice modality to it. For more details about these personalized design cards, please have a look at our paper. Now, in the figure to the right, you can see the different cards and how they are connected. The red ones being the object card, the blue being the feedback card, and here's the green being the input or the human action card. Now, during the session, participants are free to choose from the 6 scenarios that we gave them, or they could come up with even with their own scenario during the activity. Participants were grouped in pairs based on the scenarios that they selected, and they used these cards to envision the technology. Now, the last part of the study was follow-up interviews to understand participants' overall experience of the workshop and any critical feedback that they had for us. So our data includes audio recordings from the interviews and workshop, along with the design, take-home journals, final designs, and the researchers' notes. For analysis, we used constructivist grounded theory. Now let's go into the findings. We have 2 key findings. First, participants moved from stereotyping older adults in general to designing for themselves. And second, attitudes towards technology affects group dynamics and design outcome. But before I go to these overall findings, I'd like to share a couple of surprising observations from the 2 sessions. Between the 2 workshops, there was a discrepancy between what participants initially said they were interested in and what they ended up demonstrating through the design activity. So this is what our overall findings will further shed light into. Now, in the first workshop, when participants were given the option to focus on health or hobbies, health emerged as the topic that received most interest, particularly medication reminder. For example, P1 started asking others in the group about daily medications and if people forgot to take medicines. P6 described how remembering to take medicines is something they all have to do. And P5 agreed to this, saying health issues would be a priority for technology design. So in this way, we saw that medication emerged as a popular discussion topic in the first workshop, because of which we created the medication notifier scenario that I just showed. But surprisingly, when it came to the second workshop, nobody built the medication notifier idea that they had spent so much time talking about in the first workshop. Rather, they chose scenarios like taking care of the house, customized exercise, or organizing files and ideas in the house, which was a new scenario that participants had created. So this difference in participants' interests between the 2 sessions kind of made us question, like, what's actually going on? And that brings us to our first key finding, which kind of provides an answer to this behavior. That is, in the first session, participants kind of stereotyped older adults, but in the second, they thought more of themselves. As we closely analyzed the data, we learned that in the first workshop, the discussion centered on what older adults in general need. For example, P6 described how generally for older adults, health is the issue, which would be more and this topic would be more in common between them, to which others had agreed. P5 said elder health is becoming an issue. So we see these attempts to find a common interest within the group led people to think of needs of stereotypical older adult and had resulted in the topic of medication notifier. reminders. But when we conducted the follow-up interview, we found that this discussion didn't really reflect their participants' own needs. For example, P6, who actually initiated the discussion of medication reminders in the first workshop, confessed in the follow-up interview saying she wasn't very excited about it in the first place and only thought it would be a good idea. P5 also confessed fussing about medications kind of bored her. So we saw that the discussions in the first workshop didn't really stem from personal interest, but it was rather participants trying to find out what is a common ground to converge, and which led them to think of what would be appropriate for older adults as a population. But in the second workshop, we saw participants were talking of their own needs. For example, P1 and P5, who stressed heavily on medication reminders and elder health as issue in the first workshop, ended up choosing taking care of the house scenario and made a smart electronic board that would tell them about issues in their house like wiring, plumbing, unclosed doors or windows, and utility consumption. They related the design ideas heavily to their own needs, saying, how in my house I would want this bulletin board right now. So this is a picture from P1 and P5's design activity showing this. And we further ascertain that participants were speaking of their own needs by tracing much of the design features in the second design workshop to the respective take-home journals. For example, P5's journal talked about having the smart notification system along with a well-thought-out location to place this device. P5 talked of a concern with unclosed windows and knowing utility consumption in her journal. So to summarize, we saw in the first workshop, people thought about older adults in general, but in the design activity, they were designing for their own unique needs. But before going on to the next major finding, I want to talk a bit about the implications of this finding. Now, instances of older adults stereotyping themselves, as in our first session, is kind of concerning. We see that upon grouping people, they try to find out what is a common thing between them and might end up stereotyping. One approach to minimize this stereotyping could be using nominal grouping methods where each team member thinks separately and then their responses are kind of aggregated to support divergent thinking. Another thing in our approach to customize the design workshop materials based on common things that people described using or even using people's own quotes also kind of helped participants to think of their own needs. Now, the next finding is that we found that attitudes towards technology also affects group dynamics and the design outcome. Now, in this talk, I'll be sharing how group dynamics of participation was affected, but in the paper, we describe how attitudes towards technology also affected design decisions or the features that individuals added or did not add to their design. Please refer to the paper if you'd like to know more. Now, difference in attitudes towards technology at times caused tensions within participant pairs in the second workshop. This tension was evident in one pair, P2 and P3, for example. P2 in the design session mentioned that she was basically low-tech. Although her partner, P3, did not disagree at that very moment, but in the follow-up interview, she revealed how she was thinking of other ways to utilize technology, signaling their difference in attitudes towards technology. Now, this difference was also reflected in their final design outcome. They kind of separated each of their design ideas, and P3 said, these are all mine, and those were all hers. In the follow-up interview, P3 further revealed this frustration, explaining how she felt that other groups were better paired than them because they didn't really connect. So to summarize, we saw that individuals' attitudes towards technology does impact the group dynamics of participation. Now, a practical implication of this finding is how we pair participants. A major factor determining whether there could be compromise or cohesive design ideas was alignment of attitudes towards technology within the groups. A possible approach to create better pairing would be to use scales or questionnaires to measure participants' usage or attitudes towards technology and then group them accordingly. While some of these scales already exist with respect to traditional technology like computers or smartphones, we do need to update them to include perspectives of emerging technologies, which includes Internet of Things. To summarize, we saw that between the two workshops, participants shifted from thinking primarily about other older people as end users to designing for themselves. And there were times when tensions within participants arose due to the differences in attitudes towards technology. With this, I'd like to thank you for watching this video. If you have any questions or comments, we would love to hear more. Please email us. Thank you.